Here we are on Zoom again at Urban Sanctuary on Sunday morning, and my guest today is Sarah Jane Bradley. And I'm so excited, Sarah, to introduce you to the Urban Sanctuary community. I want to invite you to say hi. And as I thought about introducing you, you are involved in so many things. I had no idea how to introduce you. So how would you describe yourself and then say hi to the Urban Sanctuary community?
Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. And hello, Urban Sanctuary community. I'm so excited to be connecting and to getting to learn more about you. I am, my name's Sarah, and my pronouns are she, her. I live in Berkeley, in Huichin, Ohlone territory. Confederated Villages of Lisjan Ohlone, and I am an organizer, community organizer of lots of projects, as you mentioned. One of them is a national project called Nuns and Nuns, so Nuns and NONES. But there's also a number of other things as well, but I'll probably talk a lot about Nuns and Nuns today. But some other projects have been, I was a co-founder of an alternative grassroots divinity school called AllDiv. That was a multiracial, multi-lineage and spiritual tradition community of artists and activists and community builders who were looking for other ways to really deepen in their learning without going into institutions like divinity schools or seminaries or rabbinical schools. And as an attempt to create, I would say, like a more complex and decolonized and queer beloved community in that learning process. And that was a learning laboratory for about 3 years. And I'm also involved in some projects here locally around building tiny homes as a cooperative of apprentices in solidarity with people who need housing and also to support the housing crisis on a more systemic level. And yeah, some local other things too around kind of Indigenous solidarity efforts.
That's a lot of territory to cover. You know, our members, I can just see them right now. I know they're all wanting to ask you lots of questions about every single one of the things you just mentioned, but we'll just start where we can. So we're dipping our toe into this, and this series that we're in right now is where we're trying to understand as mainline Protestant church, urban church that's seen other churches like us around us kind of starting to close and all. We're trying to look at, rather than that depressing fact, that what's alive right now. This is the Easter season. What is alive in spiritual communities and growing and flourishing? And so I'm curious to ask you, in your day-to-day life, what does spiritual community look like for you and your friends? And how would you describe it? How is it alive for you?
That's a challenging question because I have so many communities in which I practice my spirituality. So, you know, I have we call ourselves a coven, but a group who I do lunar ritual with and practice Shabbat with quite frequently. My day-to-day can really vary depending on the season and who I'm with. So living here in my 22-person co-op is really different than when I'm with, say, the people that I work with. So when I was living, for example, with a lot of the folks I work with at a convent in Burlingame, the Mercy Convent down there, we would wake up every morning to have shared meditation practice and chanting and then move into our days of work, which tended to be online, but also tended to be really soulful, given the work that we've been doing, and often involved a lot of walks with sisters and walks with each other in the woods and in the neighborhood, and a lot of shared meals. Like, I do think shared meals are a really big part of my spiritual practice. But yeah, I have a lot of my own kind of morning and evening practices that I take part in, but I'm really hungering for more rigor and more structure in the communities in which I live in, that can meet me in the kinds of commitments I want to make.
Wow. That's an enormous amount of variety and richness too. And so let's focus in a little for a second on the nuns and nuns part.
Yeah.
So tell us a little about what, bringing those two groups of people together has been like, and what have you learned from each other, and how has it changed each of you from having that relationship with each other over time?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're not going to get a short answer here, but I think it's really interesting that you mention some of the framing of these conversations being around like the decline of so many religious communities and congregations, or at least in terms of demographics, because that is definitely a part of the story around the origin of nuns and nuns. Is, you have this huge group of millennials who check the unaffiliated box when it comes to religious affiliation, or maybe they don't even necessarily feel unaffiliated, they just feel more complicated or complex or mixed about it, which is how I feel. And because there are definitely lineages that I feel I am embodying and connected to and committed to. So you have this kind of demographic shift. And then with sisters, I mean, the average age of the American nun Catholic nun is 80. Actually, it's a few years older than that at this point. And, these are communities of sisters who have seen, their numbers swell in the 60s, and vibrant ministries pop up, and, mother houses filled with novitiates. And, they're now seeing their numbers really shift, and so many fewer women are entering religious life in that way. And, they're needing to make big choices about what do we do, and what does the future look like? How do we embrace the future? And so these two groups that, really weren't hanging out in the same circles. Like, the millennials were like this kind of like activist bunch that was, not going to church. I'll just say that. And these sisters in their 70s and 80s, at least those were the first few groups. We're now a lot more connected to younger sisters, which is a really, really big and important blessing. But the thing that brought these two together was just kind of a curiosity around what there was to learn from one another. And, there was a spiritual longing in this group of younger people. And there was a spiritual practice and experience with the sisters. And there was a longing for community, and there was experience for community. And then there were things that, that I would say that the sisters were really curious about the younger folks about too. And so in terms of how we see justice and how we see the needs of these times. And so that's kind of how things got started. And so, at the beginning, it was a coming together of these groups in different cities all across the country. And from there, just really deep relationships have been forged. And I feel really grateful for that. And it's changed my life in, I don't even know how many ways.
So I imagine that you all discovered a bit that the nuns are a bit of activists themselves.
100%. Yeah.
And so what kinds of things are you working on together?
Well,
or are you?
Well, I would say, there's a lot of a lot of our conversations have been really around how we understand spirit moving in our activism, and what it means to live out lifelong countercultural commitments to the kind of societal change and transformation we seek, and we also want to see, like, understand through ourselves in our own transformation. And so, you know, there's ways in which we've showed up together for protests and for like ICE vigils in solidarity with migrants who are being detained. We have showed up together for the election. So we partnered with the Frontline, which is kind of an arm of the Movement for Black Lives, to do election poll defense. And so organizing sisters and seekers to come to the polls together during the last election. We've also been showing up in a lot of learning together. So, you know, starting years ago, we were having conversations about white supremacy and white fragility, and having book clubs and things like that that could really support our learning. And also during last summer, during the uprisings, the Black Lives Matter uprisings and the murder of George Floyd, we hosted a lot of conversations about abolition. And so it's been more in the like conversation and learning space, you know, talking about just transition frameworks and solidarity economy. Those that we've kind of been more of in a learning mode, with like a little bit more local activation around different campaigns in each of the hubs. But I really think that that's going to be changing fairly soon. You know, we've been talking a lot about some of the local efforts to do sacred site defense that are, you know, under the leadership of a lot of the Ohlone organizers here in the Bay Area, as well as the Amal Matsoon close to where you are. So those are some things that are really activated for us. We really see our spot as being one of bridging and imagination. So right now we're creating a bunch of imagination briefs around land back and reparations and recommoning land and regenerative land use rather than conservation land use. And so we're trying to understand more of what action means on a national level, but you know, we're an interspiritual community that is committed to lives of contemplation and care and courageous action, and what that looks like really depends on the community itself.
Yeah, well, you use that word there, interspiritual, which is really a growing, rich concept. And so I want to use this to segue a little into the conversation, because I'm dying to ask you about AllDiv, which this alternative divinity school. So as someone who went to one that wasn't alternative, it was very mainstream. I'm super curious, and I know many of our congregation members just they're just voracious learners. So they love to learn new things and all, and so they probably are going to be very curious. What did you all decide to study together, and why was it really important for you to do that outside the boundaries of a traditional seminary, even though you're doing a pretty deep dive, I think, into learning?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons that we decided to do it outside of an institution is because many of us were already connected to what is a lineage of popular education. So learning in communities that are informal, grassroots, that are using their direct experience and the vulnerability of sharing that to see patterns among themselves, among their community, about the cultural, material, spiritual conditions in which they live, and really work as a group to understand what their participation or non-participation in that, what their intervention in that can be in order. From the very beginning of AllDiv, that was kind of that was the ground that it grew from. And so that's in part why it was not a bunch of people who are like, let's all, learn together while we're in an institution of higher education. And so that was one reason. I think another reason was that a lot of folks who were really interested in this didn't feel like they would be safe or feel like their dignity was fully seen and felt, or that the kind of theology that they wanted to be living out and practicing was wasn't reflected back to them in even the very architecture, like there are ways in which like certain architecture is like, I don't know if I can access the things that I want to access in this space. And so I think that was part of it, is like we were a community that folks carried their trauma from religious households and being trans, being queer, and wanted a different container to explore their relationship to divinity, and that what that study could even look like. How could that study be creative and embodied, and how could that study be relational, like showing up, how could they be studying their family, and so the text that itself of what we were studying tended to be really different than I think but I don't know. I think I have some friends in divinity school right now, and I'm hearing that divinity school is changing a lot. So This is not a dig at divinity school. I think I'd probably love it. I love school. Everybody was really exploring their own learning plan. And so people had their own anchors of what the rhythms of learning were going to look like, who their teachers were, what the courses were, what the creative projects and expressions were for them, and their North Star. And so it really was a beautiful kind of tapestry of learning. And
so, like, I think many people have the impression that nuns are distrustful of all those things are true. The nuns are distrustful of institutions, and there's trauma, and then there's been even what I would call spiritual violence that's been experienced inside some of those institutions that create significant reasons for distrust. But at the same time, what I also am seeing is what you have just described so beautifully, is this incredible spiritual hunger and curiosity and desire to learn. And so tell us just a little more about that, and where people are going, how and who's leading, who's convening, and how do people find a place then that feels safe to them?
Yeah, I think there's such a hunger. There's such a hunger among young people to live lives of meaning, lives of justice, lives that are embedded in community, lives that allow them to live out a vocation that is in service of what is needed around them and in their lives. And I think that, honestly, I mean, there's some really cool organizations and gatherings and people that are doing the like weaving. And I think my most frank answer to that is that I think a lot of those people are meeting within social justice movements, is that is where people are going, and then they're finding the kind of like spiritual leaning people and finding ways to support each other, or they're finding each other in the burnout zone when they go to like a retreat center to recover from, movement work, just kind of really extracting a lot from them, and not necessarily always being a super healthy place to be long-term.
Yeah. Hey, so I'm excited. Actually, I'm not excited to close this conversation because
oh my gosh, we're already done
for a long time. but I've been asking this closing question to a lot of different folks, and it's actually came from you. It was in our conversation last year.
Yeah.
At the beginning of this series, I told the story about how when we you and I had coffee in Berkeley, and how I felt actually, I think it really right off the bat, I just felt incredibly safe and open with you. And I told you that as a pastor, I sort of felt like I'd been a chaplain on the Titanic in my ministry, kind of watching the institution that I ultimately loved, but also knew was deeply wounded and broken throughout history, kind of going down. You turned to me and said, okay, so if that's true, like what from that would you put in the lifeboat? I found myself living with that question for a long time, actually. And so, Sarah, I'm gonna turn that question right back to you. Is there anything from even from Christianity or from the church that you see valuable that should be in the lifeboat?
Yes, there is. And I just want to quickly say, I'm in relationship with sisters who are seeing their entire way of life like come to an end, and some of these congregations have voted to come to completion, is what it's called. And the bravery of trust in recognizing that, like, the container is shifting because Spirit has broken through and is finding another way, just feels really really important to name. And I do think that we're seeing emerging forms of religious life, of committed community, of spiritual community. And I think it's just about, it's perhaps bigger than communities of religious life, and it's perhaps more connected to the prophetic and mystical lineages and traditions from which those come. And so, I would lift up, the desert mothers and fathers, and I would lift up the kind of some aspects of like the more like kind of wild heretic movements of the Middle Ages in Europe. And I would lift up, liberation theology and, or theologies, I should say, and Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. And, there's so much richness in terms of how justice is lived out. And as well as, I'm learning more about some of the saints, some of the femme saints, like Hildegard and Catherine of Siena, and those are gems of mystics, prophetesses, people who were standing up to power and in defense of life and defense of the sacred. And I would put those in the lifeboats.
I want to be in that boat.
Me too. Yeah, and I want to be in a boat that also combines, Black radical feminist tradition and, indigenous wisdom and my indigenous teachers. And, so what's the other boat? Like, what's the lifeboat? And also what's the bigger, like, what's the kind of congregation of lifeboats that we can learn from and that we can create something new from together?
Well, coming from a boating family, there's nothing more fun than being out on the water and tying your boats together and just hanging out together. I mean, there's something really incredible about that. And so it seems more like that's sort of what's happening right now. That there's a lot of different vessels out there, and that they are actually connecting to each other in some ways that are so respectful and so life-giving. So, hey, thanks for lifting that up for us today, Sarah, and for making this such a rich conversation, which I'm hoping will be continued.
I hope so too. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.